The Fertility Friday podcast is supported by the monthly women's kit by Dow Labs. Dow Labs is making Chinese herbal medicine more approachable, convenient, tasty, and accessible. Head over to mydowlabs.com and use the code fertility for 20% off your first order. Again, that's mydowlabs.com, mydowlabs.com. This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. If you're listening in real time, new groups are forming in April of 2018. Reserve your spot today by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 192. Welcome to the 192nd episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source of information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I've got a great episode for you today. In today's episode, we're talking all about traditional Chinese medicine and how traditional Chinese medicine can support menstrual cycle health in a number of different ways. And so we go through a lot of great questions and topics, from how Chinese medicine differs from Western medicine to some of the concepts in Chinese medicine. For instance, the concepts of hot and cold, or dampness, deficiency, and excess. These are concepts that are often difficult to understand, especially if you weren't trained in Chinese medicine. But we go through some of those and talk about how those concepts apply to our menstrual cycle health. We also talk about the role of herbal treatments and acupuncture. I think often when you think of traditional Chinese medicine, you immediately assume it must mean acupuncture, but there's a lot of different aspects of traditional Chinese medicine, and so we get into some of those differences in our interview today. If you're listening to this in real time, then registration is now open for Fertility Awareness Mastery. I have 2 groups forming, and at the time of this recording, I still have space in both my conception/preconception and my birth control/avoiding pregnancy groups. Now, we are meeting live every week for 10 weeks after we get started in a couple of weeks here. And so there's a limited number of women that I can accept in each group. So if you're wanting to join us, make sure to apply as soon as you can to make sure that we still have space in our group for you. And again, that's fertilityfriday.com/group program. And if you have questions for me about the program, you can always send an email to info@fertilityfriday.com. I'd love to have you in the group, and I hope to see you there. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information and details about Fertility Awareness Mastery. And before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Dow Labs. Now, Chinese medicine is a 2,500-year-old practice that encompasses everything from acupuncture to meditation and herbal medicine. And Dow Labs is committed to making Chinese herbal medicine more approachable, convenient, and accessible for the modern woman. And with that in mind, Dow Labs has developed the Women's Monthly Kit as a way to gently bring the menstrual cycle back in balance. The Women's Monthly Kit is made up of a classic combination of 2 incredibly powerful and popular formulas, Emotional Balance and Women's Formula. Now, Women's Formula is designed to be used in your pre-ovulatory phase. So after your period stops, that's when it's specifically designed to be used. And then Emotional Balance is intended for use as you approach your next period in your post-ovulatory phase. So together, these 2 formulas support hormone balance and cycle regularity. And considering that they're made from traditional Chinese herbal formulas, they actually taste pretty good. I've tried them myself. And so for more information, make sure to head over to mydowlabs.com for information about the Women's Monthly Kit. And be sure to use the code fertility at checkout to receive 20% off your first order. So again, that's mydowlabs.com. Now let's jump into today's episode. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Karchmer, to the show. Eric's fascination with Chinese medicine started over 30 years ago when he ventured to China to teach English. His passion eventually translated into an unusual career into what he calls academic medicine. Before earning a Ph.D. in anthropology from the University of North Carolina, Eric spent 5 years earning a Bachelor's of Medicine from the renowned Beijing University of Chinese Medicine, and he also attended Princeton for his undergraduate studies. Throughout his research, Eric has had the opportunity to both train with and interview leading doctors of Chinese medicine across China. And he's currently a professor of anthropology at Appalachian State University. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the application of Chinese medicine specifically to the menstrual cycle and some of the common challenges that women face with the cycle. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Eric.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today. And so just, we were talking a little bit in the pre-chat about your background and your history, but I'd love for you to share your, just a little bit about what drew you specifically to Chinese medicine. And now it seems like, a big part of your focus is on women's health in particular. So I'd be interested to hear, why you chose this area to focus on.
Well, you might be a little bit disappointed, but honestly, it was a bit of an accident. But I had lived in China for a number of years before I kind of got interested in anthropology, and I think always had been fascinated by traditional medicine there. You'll see pharmacies, all around, wherever you are, any major city, and there's aspects of Chinese medicine that sort of percolate out throughout kind of Chinese society. So those things always intrigued me. But they just seemed very foreign and exotic, and truly a little bit by accident. But I was back in Beijing to do research for my Ph.D. and had not even totally planned this, but I took some classes basically at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine and just kind of fell in love with it and kind of abandoned the original project and decided Chinese medicine would be my focus. And the original project had been related to medicine, but I decided Chinese medicine would be the project. So I kind of fell into it, but it's helped me to make sense of all these things that had kind of intrigued me while living in China. So it was a bit of an accident. Women's health is just, if you're in Chinese medicine and studying it, it's just something you realize it's just a very popular part of what doctors do, and women frequently seek out Chinese medicine gynecologists for help, and you could see that very clearly sort of in our classes and when we were training in hospitals. There was just a huge demand for that, so that was something I just kind of gravitated to as part of my training. This wasn't the only thing I was trained in, but definitely it's been one of the really interesting things I've gotten to do as a practitioner here in the U.S. is help women with gynecological and health issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always find it fascinating how people find their way into their chosen professions and careers. And I think the interesting connection between Chinese medicine and women's health, women gravitate to things that work. So I feel that's a big part of it. It's very interesting. We may not always understand exactly how it's working, but I've worked with enough women to know that these treatments, they work. So let's talk about how, just to get a sense, I've had a few practitioners of Chinese medicine on the show over the years, but I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about the difference. So you had an idea of going into medicine, you switched your focus because, as you said, you fell in love with Chinese medicine. So it's a big question, so you take it how you will, but maybe share with us just some of the ways that Chinese medicine differs from our traditional Western medical outlook and paradigm.
Oh, what a great question. And I don't know if I'll give you a good answer, but so in college I had been pre-med, and I think the sort of further I got into like all my pre-med courses, and I was a molecular biology major, I just felt less drawn to that profession. So it is interesting that, years later I sort of came back to medicine, but Chinese medicine instead. One of the things about Chinese medicine that I found really appealing is, I guess, it's holism. That sounds a bit cliche, but that is precisely sort of that's precisely what is, like, I think, the key to being successful in doing it. And you have to sort of take, like, literally everything into consideration. So I think in Western medicine, we tend to, honestly, let's take an example from gynecology. You go to see your gynecologist, and he or she may be mostly interested in your menstrual cycle and kind of a few things that seem to be associated with that. But maybe not your headaches, maybe not your constipation, maybe not, a whole set of kind of things. If they don't kind of if they aren't related to some sort of disease. Whereas in Chinese medicine, you always want to pay attention to sort of everything that's going on. So you really have to take very careful kinds of histories and really ask patients very carefully everything that's going on. And sometimes literally like the season of the year or the things you eat or things like that can be like really crucial in sort of like coming up with like the right solution. So that just felt kind of neat. It's kind of that sort of attention to detail I found really neat. And of course, it's a very different way of thinking, like a totally radically different way of thinking about the body. So maybe that seemed really just fascinating and exotic to me initially as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's a lot of concepts in traditional Chinese medicine that differ. And of course, I didn't train in Chinese medicine, so I don't know all the different concepts, but I know you've spoken about like the concepts of hot and cold, deficiency and excess, and kind of even the meaning of like blood when it's like you know, like if it's stagnated and all of those concepts are very foreign.
Yes.
To us Westerners.
Yeah, they are, and I think that's been an appeal to me. Not maybe it's not an appeal to everyone, but Chinese medicine, we're trying to think through some of those ideas, and some of them I find like so useful. I mean, I think hot and cold is one that's like really important, but really for women. Written about this and talked about this at different times, but for example, women in China think that you can really manage a menstrual cycle. My sense is that here in the North America, folks are a little bit more resigned to like, this is the way it's going to be, unless they find their way to like your podcast and realize there's more that they can do. But a lot of women, I suffer with menstrual cramps and that's just it. But, in China, for example, like being very careful about what's called cold foods that are like literally physically cold, but also foods that have maybe cold, what's considered to be cold properties. Like, and cold is sort of anything that's hard to digest, sort of raw foods or certain kinds of vegetables. Those would be things to be careful about, like right around your period, because cold can lead to pain and therefore lead to like a very painful period. So women are very cautious about those sorts of things. So there's like a lot of like really kind of like everyday kind of useful things that are in some of those ideas from Chinese medicine, and you see people sort of thinking in those terms when you live in China.
Well, maybe talk to us a little bit more about that. I mean, are there any parallel concepts? So I see, like when you say cold, like I think literal. Like I see a lot of women, because we're paying attention to the menstrual cycle chart, and as I'm sure you know, when we're doing that, part of charting your cycle is taking your basal body temperature. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm supporting a woman who's charting her cycles, it's in my face, her metabolism. I'm staring right at it. Yeah, and so a lot of women are cold, literally. When you're talking about hot and cold, that's what comes to mind. But are there any parallel concepts that could kind of help us to understand it better from a Chinese medicine perspective?
I think you're totally onto it. So, I mean, the concepts in Chinese medicine just come from really everyday life. They've just been kind of like refined a little bit and made a little more technical. But like women feeling cold, that's cold. Now, of course, in Chinese medicine, it also can be complicated. Like, what is cold caused by an excess of something that's like comes from outside that is physically cold or in some way, or is it a lack of something warming? And in Chinese medicine, we talk about a lack of yang. Yang is sort of that warming principle. So is it a lack of yang? And so that's like a really important distinction. Is it, that's that excess and deficiency distinction. But it's both cold, and so those are really important things. And of course, I'm sure you probably see heat too, like women who have like really short cycles. Usually we tend to think of that as being caused by excess heat of some kind, and it could be that, or it could be heat, excess heat, or we might call it a deficient heat. You can kind of have those concepts are they're tangible things. They're in one sense. So if you really start to pay attention to it, you'll start to see it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, traditional Chinese medicine is complicated. So for the woman who's listening and she's hearing us talk about hot and cold and deficiency and excess, like when I think of these things, because, my brain works in parallel. So I'm always trying to think of, okay, that seems like something I already know. I feel like that's our tendency as humans. So like, again, with my then basal body temperature analogy or like the thyroid analogy, like I know that like there's certain vegetables that are goitrogenic. So we have different ways of talking about things, and it's probably not the exact same thing, but we have ways of talking about things that would, in a way, seem like similar concepts. Like there's certain foods that depress thyroid function and therefore would make you cold. But I'm sure it's not that simple because it's so much more complicated than that. But that's where my brain goes. For the woman who's listening, are there ways that, so what you mentioned was that in China, women are very cautious about eating quote unquote colder foods
Uh-huh.
around the time of their menses, because there's this understanding that it could contribute to more pain. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works, or why
Um,
it does that, or is it
why
more
it
of
does
just a
that?
general understanding?
It's kind of a general principle, but so you're right to say that there's definitely connections, I think, between sort of, a more Western medicine or functional medicine approach to the body and a Chinese medicine approach. And sometimes they kind of line up and sometimes they don't. So it's not always that one-to-one connection. So that's just one thing we want to be aware of. We don't want to get too simplistic in our equations, but we can definitely make them. In terms of why cold is a problem, it's just, in fact, if we just pay attention to whenever we're sort of outside in the cold, cold makes you kind of shiver and contract and everything kind of tightens up. And it's sort of that principle of just contraction, things that are contracting and tightening up. And so if you already tend to have periods that are a little bit more on the uncomfortable side, some exposure to cold will just make it exacerbate it, make it that much worse. And so it might include cold food. It might also just be exposing yourself to the elements, right around that time too. And that could also be that's the same effect, In a certain sense, sort of straightforward, cold contraction sort of is almost always a feature of pain. And so it also extends beyond gynecology to arthritis, for example. You almost always need to think about the problem of cold, not just cold, but cold is definitely a big factor in anyone with joint pain. So I don't know, to give you an example.
Well, and when you were talking about that, I was thinking about some of the things that are healing and helpful when women are experiencing painful periods. And I was thinking about that from that heat and cold. And I thought, sometimes if you're having bad pain, it's really helpful to have a nice warm compress. And if we
Yes.
talk about castor oil packs a lot with my clients, and it's well, that's something you do with heat. And so it's interesting just to think about these concepts and how they could, how they could apply to the menstrual cycle.
That's right. And so, that's also kind of a good example too. So if sometimes it's hard to tell if something's caused by cold or hot in Chinese medicine, but if heat makes it feel good, then it's a problem of cold. And so, and then typically in kind of women's issues, you're much more worried. You tend to be more worried about cold, at least as it relates to pain, than you do about heat. There are problems with heat too, but in terms of the pain factor. So yeah, if you're experiencing pain, usually something warm, a hot water bottle, so something that's going to really feel good. And if we extended that into sort of kind of any sort of sports injury too, any kind of chronic pain. Also, in Chinese medicine, you would always recommend using a heat lamp, a hot water pack, getting some kind of heat on the injury. Whereas we tend to kind of often ice things, which maybe is okay for an acute situation, but in general, people are afraid of cold in Chinese medicine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned about raw food and how it can be more difficult to digest. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because there's certainly a trend. I mean, most of us are trying to incorporate more vegetables, and there's a lot of information out there telling us that we should be eating our vegetables raw to get our enzymes and things like that. And I'm sure that a balance is always a good thing to aim for. But I just wanted to touch on what you said about the raw foods and the digestive, because I know a lot of the women I work with have some sort of digestive factor issue there. So.
Yeah. So that's actually really important and a little bit counterintuitive to sort of the way we tend to think about nutrition. So I think raw food is kind of in principle, but in practice we just have to kind of see. And I think for women who struggle with some digestive issues, that might be one problem that you want to, or something to be very careful about. And so in particular, this is sort of vegetables, things like in the brassica family, like kale or broccoli, those kinds of, some of those darker greens, they're going to probably be a little bit harder to digest. So better to have your broccoli cooked than to have it raw, probably, if digestion can be an issue for you. Another trick too that can be really helpful in Chinese medicine, ginger is a warming herb and something that's great to cook with. So cooking your kale with some ginger is probably going to be much easier in your stomach than having it raw in a salad or something like that. So it's a little counterintuitive to the way we think about, nutrition in the West. But if for women with digestive issues, if you start paying attention to it, you might really start noticing some connections there. That can be really helpful, as well as sort of, cold food straight from the fridge. Like I've seen this. For example, I've got a 4-year-old son who just like absolutely loves yogurt, just like cannot get enough of yogurt. But yogurt, although we think of it as being good for digestion, so kind of like your vegetables, usually comes straight from the fridge. It's usually cold, and like time and time again, he's always complained about having a kind of he's always had a delicate stomach, and he always complains about his stomach hurting. And finally, it just sort of like, I mean, this is something I should have known from my practice and my training, but I finally just realized, like, it's the yogurt. The yogurt is what's hurting his stomach. We've got to like cut back on the yogurt. It's really bad for him. So now we're much more kind of cautious, and we try to actually do sometimes like some of those unrefrigerated yogurt packs. And so this was something that women can pay attention to. And I would add to that actually also leftovers is something to think about too, especially like broccoli or kale. Those would probably be, if you're good with them sort of freshly cooked and it doesn't bother you, that's fine. But like 2 days later or even a day later, it might turn out to be much harder on your stomach. And so that's also something to maybe just be cautious about if you're dealing with some digestive issues. Yeah.
When you say that, I think to myself, so are we talking about digestive issues that you would also be aware of? I mean, one of the things, I'm sure you found this in some of the patients and clients that you work with, but you know, sometimes it's like you're connecting people back to their own body, things that they're not necessarily paying attention to. So perhaps the broccoli was bothering them all along, but they were so used to it that they didn't really pay attention to it. And when you kind of shined a light on that and said, okay, so how do you feel when you eat this or that? All of a sudden it becomes apparent. So is it more of, because it's interesting, like you can read stuff about eating a certain way and then you can eat that way and it can bother your stomach, but you think it's healthy because I read this thing. But really, I think my personal opinion is that we have to really pay attention to our bodies and kind of focus on what those responses really are and kind of let that be your guide.
So I agree. We do have to pay attention to our bodies, but also at the same time, we're sometimes not as connected to them as we should be. So when you do kind of, and I've had this with many patients, you know, and I've said, you know, with struggling with, you know, not necessarily women struggling with digestive issues. And it's like, you know, you might really want to like be careful about the leftovers. And they're like, what? That's like their whole like kind of like financial plan, you know, to get through. Or it's the way they budget their time and money, you know, like I'm going to get through the week by cooking everything on Sunday. So they're really upset when I say that to them. But, you know, very often they kind of like, they start checking in with that and they realize it actually is a problem. So,
well, okay. What is the issue with the leftovers? Like, is there now I want to know, what is this? What is it about?
I don't have like a great Chinese medicine answer for you. I just think it's just a little bit less fresh.
But you have found that it does disturb the digestion more.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I'll give you an example. My wife, who used to always have stomach problems, now interesting in her case, I don't think it ever led to any gynecological issues. So sometimes the two are connected and sometimes they aren't. But I kind of got her to, I mean, she also used to cook with a lot of garlic, for example. Garlic is not cold. It's actually very warming, but it was like too much. And sometimes things in the garlic and onion family can upset your stomach too. So, you know, I got her to cut back on a few things. And, you know, another thing I got her to do was also to eat regular meals. Like a lot of us will, this is something you would see in China also. Every Chinese friend will be very fastidious about this, like having meals, kind of like 3 meals a day, three reasonable meals. And I think in the US and Canada and maybe Europe, maybe less Europe actually, but certainly in the US though, you know, people will skip meals or have a late lunch or just have a bar for a meal or something like that. And that's just sort of that kind of attitude about meals is like totally unacceptable in China. So regularity in food is also very important. So being regular, eating kind of full meals, the leftovers, I think just something about it sitting in the fridge for a day or two just makes it a little bit harder to digest than it was before. So the kale works, you know, freshly cooked, but just not quite as well after that. And so with my wife, for example, I got her to kind of like just really pay, like some days she would have, she'd complain about her stomach hurting. I was like, so what'd you have for lunch? She's like, oh, I had a very healthy lunch. I had an apple and some peanuts while I was driving a car to a meeting or something. No, that's not, you know, people in China would just be, you know, shocked at that response. So just with a little attention to some of those details and that focus kind of on regularity, it can be really important with digestion. And so, and that's kind of really some of the same attitudes you need with like the same kind of attention that you need about your menstrual cycle as well. Anyways, it can make a big difference. And so my wife, she now never complains about her stomach hurting, but she's at the same time, she probably won't have the leftover broccoli, So she knows to stay away from a few things.
Well, maybe take us through some of, I know that, so, I have a lot of contact with my audience. And so in my Facebook community and in the clients I work with, so I kind of have a sense, like, I'm trying to think of the phrase, and it's like to the pulse of what people are dealing with. And I think some of the common challenges that women are dealing with their menstrual cycle, a lot of my clients struggle with bleeding. So bleeding premenstrually or postmenstrually. Some clients will struggle with bleeding kind of throughout the whole cycle. Many clients struggle with pain, to which Western medicine says pill or painkiller.
Right. Right.
So maybe we could start there and just talk about some of the applications of Chinese medicine to support women with some of these types of challenges.
Sure. So, those are all, complicated issues. Where should we start?
Well, maybe with the spotting, because
the spotting. Okay. And you're usually sort of like before or after the cycle, maybe, or after after your period. There could be a number of causes for this. And this is where you might really need to see a practitioner and really kind of work out the details. But just to give you some examples of some possibilities, one thing you might see that might be common in women who are maybe like in their 30s, I'd say, or maybe even late 30s, but it's probably that age. It doesn't necessarily have to be that age, but you might start seeing some of that spotting, kind of before and after the period. The period seems to never quite end. And typically that might be related to, in Chinese medicine, what we call a qi deficiency. And that's, qi is, this, we often translate that as kind of energy, although it's really sort of more than that, but it's a way of talking about sort of flows in the body as well. And if qi is a little bit deficient, qi has this property of sort of retaining things. And so when you get, just a little bit, unfortunately, when we get just a little bit older, into our 30s or something like that, we're going to have that sort of tendency, 40s, have that tendency to just be a little bit more, just, so it's kind of just, living life, be a little bit more run down than they were before. And that might show up with some spotting around your cycle, around your period, sorry. But that's one possibility. Now, there could be other explanations too. So it could be some other things like blood stagnation. It might even be some heat, kind of depending on some of the whole picture of what's going on.
Well, what I've seen quite a bit of is that there's no specific kind of every woman's, it's something you said earlier, actually. You said something about, and I'm not sure if this was on the call or off the call, but you said that, two women could have very similar issues. I think you gave the example of PCOS. So this might have been in our pre-chat, but
yes.
And it could show up very differently. So, I often see the irregular bleeding in women who have recently come off of hormonal contraceptives.
Yes,
I feel like more so than women who haven't been on them or haven't been on them for a long time.
That's a good thing where we could talk about the Chinese medicine perspective. And I've had quite a few, so I'm sure you've seen a lot of this too, but women who come off hormonal contraceptives might have a really hard time kind of getting their, some they don't, but some do have a really hard time getting their period back. Others have a really hard time getting pregnant. I'm thinking more recently, I remember treating a patient with really terrible acne as a result of kind of getting off birth control pills. So there's kind of a whole set of things that can happen. And that idea of deficiency can be a little bit helpful here. So if we think of birth control pills as this sort of exogenous, external source of hormones coming into the body, which is what they are, they're interrupting this very complicated hormonal feedback loop that goes on in the body that regulates the menstrual cycle. And as a result, a woman's ovaries aren't producing hormones, and the whole system is kind of disrupted as a result. And you could think of yourself as kind of becoming a little bit deficient as a result of just you haven't had to do, your body hasn't really had to regulate itself in the way it normally would, and so it's not quite able to do it again. Especially if you've been taking birth control pills for a number of years. That's a very common problem. I've definitely seen a good number of women struggling with a number of issues related to that. And often you need to that idea of deficiency will be really important in Chinese medicine to think how can we help the body kind of get back on track?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting concept. I really like the way that you describe that. kind of taking into consideration that the effect of the hormones and how it kind of disrupts your natural cycle and then leaving you deficient. I feel like that's a really interesting way to think about it, because if you look at what the science has to say about it, there is this kind of noted temporary delay in the return of fertility in the research that they kind of gloss over and say, well, it returns to normal eventually, so it's totally fine. It's only temporary, but it's there.
It's amazing how easily they gloss over that.
Yeah, it's totally out of control, but it is there, and I feel like that is very much in line with how you described it. Like, it takes the body a bit of time to bounce back to normal.
Yeah, for sure. And now, when I was training in China, birth control pills were not that popular at the time. And this was back in the late '90s. I'm sure they're used more widely in China than they probably were before. But I think even now, my sense is that women are a little bit more cautious about using them. But I remember asking a teacher who was a very, very well-known gynecologist. I was like, so what would be your explanation for like what birth control pills do to a woman's body? And her response, which shocked me a little bit, but she said, it makes the ovaries wither. Maybe that's a little bit extreme, but what she was trying to get at was this idea of like, the ovaries and that whole hormonal feedback system, that they don't have to do the work they have to do. So they kind of, they're functionally not quite able to work in the way that they were. And just for some reason, some women will bounce back faster than others. And that's kind of, I think, related to these, how we're all different individually, and also maybe related to other things that are going on. And this is where the holism of Chinese medicine can be really interesting. But let's say you've been on the birth control pill for a number of years, but you're also struggling with, say, like digestive issues, like we've just been talking about, or maybe it's thyroid issues. You're probably going to be that person who's much more likely to struggle to get your period back than somebody else who's otherwise pretty healthy.
I think that's a really important point, that kind of pointing out the individual differences between people and how everyone kind of has their own weak points. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I also kind of wanted to tag on to what you said. You said the word wither, and you said it's probably a strong word. So I just want to share with you, because I've been doing a bunch of research, and I found this article that they measured the ovarian volume of women post birth
my
control.
Goodness.
Yeah, it was 50% lower.
You're kidding.
No, wow. I'm really not.
Okay, So I thought she was just exaggerating, but maybe she was really onto something.
Yeah, it's I couldn't even believe what I was reading, but yeah, 50% the ovarian volume. So that it could be, she could have been talking literally.
Yes, she could have.
But they bounce back. It's not that they don't bounce back. It's just that very strange.
Yes. That's amazing. Well, I think this also kind of goes to like this key difference in Chinese medicine and kind of like things like birth control pills and Western medicine, which is that, and herbs are a big part of Chinese medicine. People in kind of the West know acupuncture a little bit better, but it's also wonderful too. But herbs are interesting in comparison to our therapies in Chinese and Western medicine, because in general they're kind of gentle. Which doesn't mean they're not powerful, but they work through kind of like making these sort of fine adjustments, as opposed to kind of clobbering the body with like the sledgehammer, which is what I would call like birth control pills. And actually, and I think the analogy in fertility treatment is also the same too. So a lot of women who are struggling to get pregnant will turn to Western medicine for fertility treatment, which is, and if it works for you, great. Obviously, the results are sort of what count in the end, but it's not easy. And even sort of like the first line of treatment, which is usually something like Clomid, which makes you ovulate. There's nothing quite that powerful in Chinese medicine that's just going to like kind of at the snap of a finger, like force ovulation to happen. But herbal medicine and Chinese medicine will help you regulate the whole period so that ovulation happens when it should happen, and it sort of optimizes it, if you will. So it just kind of, it's a very different approach. But to me, that's part of the beauty of Chinese medicine is it's gentle adjustments as opposed to, something maybe more powerful than we need.
Well, maybe you could share a little bit about that. So I think you're right when you say, that as we know more about and we're more familiar with the concept of acupuncture than herbal treatment. So when it comes to supporting women in terms of different challenges with the menstrual cycle and things like that, I know a lot of women turn to acupuncture. Is it kind of the same thing, just a different approach, or are there fundamental different? I mean, obviously the list of herbs I'm sure is endless, but maybe share with us just some of the kind of fundamental differences or similarities there.
Well, they're both very useful, and the sort of general principles are very much the same. I mean, they come out of that sort of the same tradition, but acupuncture it's really wonderful. I would say that if there's one difference that I think you can really put your finger on, it might be especially treating like this idea of like deficiency. So we talked about sort of spotting can sometimes be caused by deficiency. That might be a case where the herbs might be a little bit more powerful than acupuncture. And sometimes I can give you some examples if you want, but I think dealing with deficiency is probably because the herbs that help to treat deficiency are these, it's something like along the lines of like ginseng is something people often know, or dongui is a Angelica sinensis is a popular herb, but those things sort of they tonify or supplement qi or supplement blood, or they sort of restore the body in a certain way. And there's something about those herbs that sort of build you back up a little bit. So I've actually treated some acupuncturists who don't really do herbal medicine. And that's sort of sometimes how they describe their experience. They're like, yeah, I feel like I'm actually putting something beneficial into my body in a way that I can't quite do with acupuncture. But both are very powerful. So, and I do both. So I don't want to say one's necessarily better, but sometimes it depends on the problem, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and so for women who are listening and they're thinking about ways to support their menstrual cycle health, their fertility, women who have been trying to conceive, what advice, if any, would you give to them in terms of finding a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, what to look for, or just in general, how to apply some of these principles?
I definitely think for women with like more complicated problem, well, I think any woman that's struggling with fertility really should look around for like a really qualified Chinese medicine practitioner, because there's so much you can do with Chinese medicine. And I think, as we talked about before the show, I think you can complement some of the other kinds of dietary and lifestyle changes that women are now kind of tuning into and giving priority to. So that really goes together with some of the other positive changes that we sometimes need to make in our lifestyles. Finding someone good is that's not always so easy, but certainly it's something to kind of be looking around for. A quick plug to Dow Labs, our company, but we've been trying to do like a lot of kind of education on our website. And so one thing we've done too is actually publish like little recipes on the website too that might be helpful for menstrual cramps and things like that. So I think kind of there's a lot of information out there in Chinese medicine, a lot of little things we can do can be helpful. And I think all those little things start to add up.
Well, and, I get a lot of questions from my listeners, from my clients. How would you know? What would you, if you're looking for a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, if you're looking for someone to do acupuncture or herbal treatments, what do you look for? How would you? Yeah, like, so, because you mentioned, I think you said like, yes, if you find somebody good. So how do we know if they're good?
Yeah, a great question. Bottom line is results. You really should see some benefit, and then you should see it like reasonably quickly. Now, with gynecological issues, especially like fertility, sometimes it's like a bit mysterious. Sometimes, I'll have women who seem to have like nothing wrong with them, but they still can't get pregnant, and you're like, oh, geez, this woman seems like maybe she's a little bit too skinny. It's hard to like figure out exactly what the problem is. But bottom line is you really should see some results. So, if you're now sometimes because there may not be much going on in between the actual periods, your problem is really like painful periods, or the irregularities that's where the irregularities really show up, and the rest of the month you seem to be reasonably healthy. So you do have to maybe give it a little bit of time, but within like 1 or 2 cycles, you should really be noticing some differences, I think. Fertility can be a little bit more complicated, sometimes very, very complicated, and that you need to give that months. But you should be able, practitioners should be able to sort of feel it. And sometimes, of course, we're not always so clued in. And I feel like I have to educate my patients like, hey, this is like, wasn't your back pain really bothering you a few weeks ago? And you're like, yeah, it really was. I was like, well, that's significant. That's gone away. Like, that's also part of like the picture. Sometimes you have to be shown it a little bit, but you should be able to kind of see results, I think. Mm-hmm. And so in the case of some gynecological issues, you have to wait a little bit longer. But normally I tell my patients if it's something you got going on every day, within a week or two, you should be feeling better.
Hmm. Well, and of
Yeah.
course, that's one of the benefits. That's why I love fertility awareness charting so much, because you can see a lot of subtleties when you're charting in a certain kind of
Yes,
way.
yes, yes. Yep.
So then even if your problem isn't like, no problem goes from like really, really bad to 100% solved in 3 days. I mean, some of them do, but it
Mhm.
depends on the problem. Most of them don't.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes, that's right. And yes, and actually, and I think the rule of thumb is like, the longer you've had the problem, the longer it's going to take to turn it around. So, and if you're doing things like a charting, which is really great. I mean, I try to get patients to do that, but they don't always want to. But if women can make that commitment to really following the basal body temperature and following cervical mucus and things like that, then there's a lot more also things to follow too, and you start to see some of those changes much more quickly, and you'll notice you notice things happening. And when you see things, and when you see things happening, then you start to feel pretty good. Yeah, this person is doing a good job.
well, that's very good. I think that's really good to know, just to keep in the back of your mind. And so, through your company, the one you mentioned, Dow Labs, you've developed some formulations as a way to try to make Chinese medicine more accessible to women. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about those formulations and why you created them and what it is that they do.
Sure, I didn't create them. They're very old formulas,
Well, I
but they
suppose
are.
put them
But
together.
we sort of put them together. We've put them together, and we've kind of made it. In the future, I think we're going to have some proprietary products, but these are some old formulas that are very commonly used in Chinese medicine, and we've kind of put them in some sort of easy to take, like little packets that also taste good. Often herbal medicine tastes very bad. So there's two formulas that I think are really important for women's medicine, and there's really more than that, but the two most basic ones are one we call women's formula and one we call emotional balance. And in Chinese medicine, like one of the key, like the most important principle in Chinese medicine gynecology is this idea of blood, which is not quite the same notion of blood as we have in conventional Western medicine. It's a little bit broader, and it's not quite as specific about it's not specific at all about like white blood cells or platelets or anything like that. But blood is thought to be sort of at the root of women's issues. You literally bleed once a month, lose a lot of blood when you give birth. And so there's historically been a concern about like losing blood in Chinese medicine. And so one formula, women's formula, is a formula that's designed to sort of replenish blood a little bit. And so that's a formula and this is used very commonly in China. It's sometimes it's used by women on their own. It's also like the foundation of like a lot of gynecological formulas. So doctors will take this formula and they'll modify it depending on what's going on with the particular patient. But it's a kind of a general sort of formula that's actually quite kind of safe and easy to use for a lot of women. And the way you might use it in China would be you take it for the first part of your cycle. So just after your period ends, bleeding stops, maybe give it a day to make sure it really has stopped. And then a typical way when we would use it would be to take it for like 5 or 6 days. And that's sort of to both kind of replenish a little bit what's lost through the period, but also to kind of get your cycle off to a good start. And then that usually translates into often sort of a better period, like when that comes around, ideally in the next, in a month. And the other formula, emotional balance, is a formula about qi, about dealing with what's called qi constraint or some sort of obstruction to the flow of qi. Emotional balance is also a very interesting formula. In Chinese medicine, qi and blood are kind of a pair. So blood is sort of what carries the qi, and qi is what makes blood flow. So if you treat blood, sometimes you also need to treat qi, and vice versa. So emotional balance is a formula that has a long history actually in gynecological use, and it would be something to help with qi constraint. And often that might be something that sort of shows up like with PMS symptoms, like at the end of your cycle. And you could kind of think of that transition at the end of your cycle as a place where things get a little bit stuck. That shift doesn't happen quite as smoothly as it should. And you might end up with breast tenderness or irritability, emotional volatility, all kinds of things. So that's a good time to take it. And another time that I've found in my practice is also right at like leading up to and right kind of through ovulation. And we could think of that as another moment of kind of hormonal shift in the cycle. So sometimes that's will often be used as like a little kind of fertility, a sort of a very general formula. So obviously if women have complicated things going on, it may not be an ideal fit, but in general, it's not a bad combination. And so what they might do is start with women's formula, the formula that tonifies blood at the beginning of the cycle, follow that pretty immediately afterwards with emotional balance. And then you can really sort of optimize and help facilitate ovulation, hopefully right in the middle of the cycle. And that can be a big problem for women if they aren't ovulating at a regular time. And that's going to be a big impediment to getting pregnant. Women's formula at the beginning of the cycle to tonify blood, followed by emotional balance to help move Chieve, is in the right sort of around the middle of the cycle when ovulation should be happening. Could be a very useful combination, particularly I think for women who have like a more mysterious kind of problem with like fertility. For instance, if you've got PCOS or endometriosis, those may not be like the ideal solutions for those problems. But there's a good number of women out there who really don't know what's going on, and they've seen a lot of specialists, and nobody can give them a really great answer for why they can't get pregnant. And in those situations, that might be sort of just what you need. Things are just a little bit off, and these are like the adjustments that maybe your body needs to make.
With these formulas, then, so you described a little bit from a Chinese medicine perspective, like what they're doing, but most of us listening to the episode are coming from a Western perspective. And, I get a lot of really excellent questions. Like, my audience is really smart. And so they ask me questions. So if I ever mention a study, I get emails. Where's the study, Lisa? We talk about hormones. And so is there, from a hormonal perspective, are these formulas helping to, because I know how the cycle works and I know that it's related to hormone production, I would imagine that if these formulas are supporting kind of the restoration of a normal, healthy cycle, they must be doing something to the hormones or encouraging the healthy production of them.
Yes, for sure. And, and I think the same is true for acupuncture. So if you're doing acupuncture and your acupuncturist is doing a good job in treating you for fertility issues or gynecological issues, and it works, it's definitely working at the level of hormones. Although acupuncture and herbal medicine also treat other things too. So it's not always working at that level. So I think the hormonal regulation kind of follows as a result, but it's not. But the herbs themselves aren't they don't really do it because they're like mimicking hormones. They aren't like estrogen-like, progesterone-like kinds of active ingredients in them. So I think the result is like some sort of hormonal regulation. It's just as kind of in a very different way though, like from a very different process, which is hard to put your finger on necessarily. And it's a little bit like when we were talking about like hot and cold at the beginning of the talk. Like it's kind of a very foreign concept, but it kind of gets at something.
Something came to mind when you were talking about acupuncture. And so it gets really complicated when you start to understand the physiology, what types of things can interfere with ovulation. But now this is just an example. And I just want to kind of, I'll share it with you and you can let me know if it kind of gives at least some sort of understanding of how affecting one area could help another area, but it's not necessarily directly, like you're not taking a hormone. But I thought about, inflammation. So if you have an inflammatory process that's going on in your body, you do some sort of treatment that reduces that inflammation. Ovulation can be a byproduct of that because inflammation, can interfere with ovulation because of all the different, all of the different hormones and all that stuff. So just, I feel like I get what you're saying, but it's.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's an excellent example. And the body's so much more complicated than we realize. And so even when we speak of like hormonal feedback loops, I mean, there's so many factors that kind of go into that. And of course, women, when you're stressed or something like that, your period can be delayed. Ovulation can be easily thrown off. But yeah, there's just a very different way of thinking about it. Inflammation is a good example too. People always ask me for things for inflammation, and I have to kind of pause for a second and translate that back into Chinese medicine and think, okay, what do they mean? But for example, joint pain came up earlier in our conversation, and you would think of that as inflammation in conventional Western medicine. But in Chinese medicine, you have to think of it in terms of cold and wind and dampness and things like that. And you have to treat it that way. You have to deal with those problems. But in another situation, you might be dealing with heat and some sort of toxicity and other things. And so it might be approached differently for a different problem. There often isn't any one answer, but the end result, with Chinese medicine is that we do get to this more balanced place. And I think because our bodies and particularly women's bodies and gynecology is like so complex. It's hard for us to kind of put our fingers on it. But in some ways, like I think the general principles of Chinese medicine help us get there sometimes a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's definitely a different way of thinking about the body. And I think the analogy that you gave, kind of like this gentle nudging in the right direction, you did mention that there's some women who, I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Like, it sounds as though you've taken some of you mentioned like general formulas that are sometimes the base of other more complex formulas in specific situations. So it sounds like this is kind of like a way to just gently nudge the body in the right direction. And so it can be really helpful in a general way. And then, but for some women, of course, who are dealing with more complex challenges, of course, there may be additional things that they need to do to really get, like if your cycle is way off base, you may have to do additional things to really focus on bringing it back.
Yes, that's right. And, for some of those more complicated problems like, endometriosis, for example, that's often thought of in Chinese medicine as to be related to like blood stagnation. Like women's formula and emotional balance, they're not really going to get at the root of that. I don't think. They might be helpful, but they're not really formulas for blood stagnation. There's other formulas for that. And again, there could be other complicating factors along with all that. So kind of just like the practitioners too. Like if these formulas were to work, you should also notice benefits like pretty quickly. And it shouldn't be. And if you're feeling worse, you definitely don't want to keep doing them. That's not the right thing for you. But in general, these particular formulas sort of fit with like the basic principles of Chinese medicine, and that's why we think they're kind of good for a lot of women. Not everyone, but for a lot.
All right. Well, so for our, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about a lot of different topics and really introduced the concept of Chinese medicine and talked a little bit about how it differs to conventional Western medicine. And so, given everything we talked about today, what is the main takeaway that you want the listener to leave with?
Oh, I think the main takeaway is this point we talked about earlier about this idea that we can do something. And this is, of course, I think maybe your main takeaway too from a lot of the work you do is that we can really like make small but like meaningful adjustments to like lifestyle, diet, and sometimes you want to add some medicine in there too to really affect our bodies and get to sort of a healthier, more balanced place. And so I think there's so much more that we can do than we often realize. Whatever the problem is, bringing that attitude towards the problem, I think can be really important because then that just takes, then you start exploring other options and doors start opening and suddenly you see a different way forward.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great note to end on, and I couldn't agree more. There's always something that you can do.
So much. Yeah.
And I know so many of my clients are told by their physicians very often, like, there's nothing you can do. So I think it's really helpful to keep that in mind. So where can our listeners go to find out more information about you, what you do, if any of our listeners happen to be in your area and have the opportunity to work directly with you, and also more information about the products that you were mentioning?
Sure. Well, I'm personally in Boone, North Carolina. So if you're in the mountains of North Carolina, by all means, come see me in my clinic. I'm at the Boone Healing Arts Center in Boone. I'm also part of Dow Labs, as we mentioned, and we have a website, mydowlabs.com. There's a lot of just great basic information about Chinese medicine on that website. We're trying to make it as educational as possible, and lots of also great recipes as well. And that's where you'll find some of these products. And I've written all the sort of introductions to like the products and how they sort of work in terms of Chinese medicine. So there's lots of places people can go there to kind of read more about just sort of the basics about Chinese medicine and more specifically about these products.
All right. Well, thank you again for being on the show. It was my pleasure to have you.
Lisa, thank you so much. And this was such an enjoyable conversation. What a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/192. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Eric. It was a really great opportunity to be able to chat with him and to pick his brain and to go a little bit deeper into Chinese medicine and the application specifically of Chinese medicine to the menstrual cycle. And I think you could hear the challenge in describing the methodology of Chinese medicine because it's a very different concept. It's just a very different philosophy about health and the body compared to Western medicine. And I've interviewed a number of traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, and what I always find is that there's a little bit of challenge in terms of translating the traditional Chinese medicine idea or paradigm or philosophy directly over to Western medicine, because there's often no specific equivalent, just because the philosophies and the understanding are so different. And, I was talking to Eric in the pre-chat before we recorded our interview, and one of the things I said to him was that, women are drawn to traditional Chinese medicine because it works. Many women are drawn to acupuncture because it does improve the menstrual cycle, whether it specifically improves the menstrual cycle flow, whether it specifically encourages a more balanced cycle. Women are drawn, or in the case of endometriosis or period pain, acupuncture, for example, reduces period pain. And so, regardless of the reason why, women are drawn to traditional Chinese medicine because it works and because it's very helpful and effective for issues related to the menstrual cycle. It was nice having Eric on the show, really just to give us some more insight into the application of traditional Chinese medicine with regards specifically to the menstrual cycle. And of course, a special thank you to the show sponsor, Dow Labs. Again, more information you'll find over at mydowlabs.com. And if you have not yet jumped in and joined us for Fertility Awareness Mastery, I want to see you in there. These groups are phenomenal. Every time I run these groups, I always say I attract the sweetest and nicest women to me. And these programs have been just incredible. I always find that by the end of the program, all of the women in the group are so confident in charting their cycles and interpreting it. And it's a really effective way to kind of shortcut your learning curve with regards to the fertility awareness method. So what I love about the groups is that regardless of where you're at when you start, regardless of whether you are completely brand new, I know some women will ask me, like, do I need to have some experience? Like, maybe I should get a couple months charting experience under my belt before I join your program. And I always say, no, you don't need any experience. I've had a lot of women who join the program and they've never charted their cycles before, and they're using this as an opportunity to really jump in and get started. So whether you are totally green and you haven't even charted one cycle before, or whether you've had, a year or more of charting experience or anywhere in between, the program is equally helpful for women of all levels. And I've seen that time and time again. So regardless of where you start from, you really do end up at basically the same spot in terms of your knowledge and confidence level, even if you had charting experience before. So again, for more information and to apply to join us in the next 2 weeks to start our 10-week program, head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. I can't wait to see you in there. And I just want to thank you so much for listening to the show and supporting the show, sharing the show with your friends, spreading the word. I really believe that the world is going to be different. One woman at a time. I really believe that, the more women that learn fertility awareness, the more women that learn how to understand and interpret their fertile signs and really take charge and take control of their fertility, of their menstrual cycles, and really start to see the connection between their overall health and their cycles. I really think the world is going to be different. And so I'm one of those people that's crazy enough to believe that the world will change because of just each of you listening, one woman at a time, sharing the word, and really just empowering all of us to understand and appreciate our menstrual cycle health. So thank you so much for being a part of the Fertility Friday community. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.